Western Desert, Egypt, October 23, 1942. 9:30 in the evening. The heat of the day has drained out of the sand, and beneath a sky crowded with stars, a low mechanical growl rolls across the desert floor. To a German reconnaissance pilot circling high above 3 nights earlier, this stretch of desert told a clear story. In the north, close to the coast, a scattering of ordinary supply lorries sat parked in loose formation, unremarkable and unthreatening. Far to the south, half hidden but not quite hidden enough, lay row upon row of tanks, guns, and a pipeline under construction, all pointing towards a slow, cautious buildup weeks away from readiness. It was a story the German High Command believed completely. It was also, in every important respect, a lie. The lorries in the north were not lorries. They were Sherman and Grant tanks, each one wearing a canvas and plywood disguise called a sun shield, bolted over the turret and hull to alter its silhouette from the air. The tanks in the south were not tanks. They were wood and canvas frames stretched over old truck chassis, built to weigh almost nothing and fool everyone. 900 genuine tanks had been made to look like 300 trucks. A phantom force of dummy vehicles had been made to look like the real attack. In a matter of hours, General Bernard Montgomery intended to unleash the Second Battle of El Alamein from precisely the direction the enemy least expected, using armor the enemy did not believe was there. This is the story of how a small unit of artists, camouflage officers, and stage designers helped an entire British army vanish in plain sight, and in doing so, changed the course of the war in North Africa. Why this mattered is simple. Deception, properly executed, could achieve what months of additional tanks and men could not. Total surprise against an enemy who thought he already knew exactly where and when the blow would fall. By the autumn of 1942, the war in North Africa had reached a point of genuine crisis for the Allies. Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps, alongside its Italian allies, had pushed British and Commonwealth forces back across Libya and into Egypt, halting only at a modest railway stop called El Alamein, barely 100 kilometers from Alexandria and the Suez Canal. Should Rommel break through, the entire eastern Mediterranean, and with it Britain's oil supply routes and imperial communications, would be exposed. Winston Churchill understood the stakes with characteristic bluntness, and he wanted victory before the year was out. The trouble was that victory, in the conventional sense, looked extraordinarily difficult to arrange. The Alamein position was a narrow corridor, barely 60 kilometers wide, hemmed in by the Mediterranean to the north and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south. There was no open flank to exploit, no clever maneuver available. Any attack would have to go straight through prepared German and Italian defenses, thick with minefields the soldiers grimly nicknamed the Devil's Gardens, extensive belts of wire, and interlocking fields of fire. Montgomery, newly arrived to command the Eighth Army, faced a problem that numbers alone could not solve. He had roughly 195,000 men against Rommel's 116,000, and around 1,030 tanks against perhaps 520 on the Axis side, many of them Italian machines of inferior quality. On paper, this looked like a decisive advantage. In practice, an attacker assaulting fixed defensive positions traditionally needed odds far greater than 2-to-1 to guarantee success, and Rommel, though absent on medical leave for the opening of the battle, had left behind a defensive scheme that his subordinate General Georg Stumme executed with grim competence. Worse still, both sides had spent months watching one another across a static front, and aerial reconnaissance meant that any conspicuous buildup of men, vehicles, fuel, or ammunition would almost certainly be spotted well in advance. Rommel, an experienced desert campaigner, expected an attack in the north, where the terrain favored a rapid armored breakthrough towards the coast road. If Montgomery simply massed his forces exactly where logic suggested, he would be attacking into the teeth of German expectations, sacrificing the element of surprise that any attacking commander craves. The challenge, then, was not merely to win the battle. It was to win it, while persuading Rommel's forces that the main effort would come from somewhere else entirely, and that it would not be ready for weeks. That meant hiding an army of nearly 250,000 men, and conjuring another one from nothing, without a single German aircraft or spy realizing the difference. The task of solving this impossible problem fell to a peculiar collection of men who, before the war, had built their careers not on the battlefield, but in the world of illusion. Chief among them was Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Barkas, formerly a documentary filmmaker, who had been appointed Chief Camouflage Officer for the Middle East. Working alongside him was Major Tony Ayrton, an artist and a team drawn from theater design, film production, and architecture. Men trained to think about how the human eye and the camera lens could be tricked. They operated under the broader deception scheme codenamed Operation Bertram, itself part of a wider effort to disguise the timing and location of the Alamein offensive. Their guiding principle, borrowed from stage magic, was simple in theory and formidably difficult in practice, namely that a good deception does not merely conceal what is real, it also displays something false with enough conviction that the observer stops looking for the truth. The centerpiece of their work was the sun shield, a lightweight frame of tubular steel and canvas that could be fitted over a tank in a matter of minutes, transforming its silhouette from a distinctly military shape into that of an ordinary 3-ton lorry. From ground level, the disguise would not have survived close inspection, but from the altitude of a reconnaissance aircraft, several thousand meters up, a sunshield-covered tank looked convincingly like a soft-skinned vehicle. Roughly 1,000 of these covers were manufactured in workshops around Cairo and Alexandria, using canvas, wood battens, and wire in quantities that strained local supply. Using this trick, the entire armored strength intended for the northern sector of the attack, the genuine spearhead of Montgomery's assault, was moved forward and parked in full view of German aerial reconnaissance disguised as an unremarkable transport park. Meanwhile, in the southern sector, where Rommel's planners expected any diversionary threat at most, Barkas's team built an entire phantom army. Dummy tanks made from plywood frames stretched with canvas, light enough for 2 men to lift into position, were arrayed in formations designed to mimic genuine armored concentrations. A fake water pipeline, built at a deliberately slow and visible pace using real trenching and dummy pipe sections made from empty petrol cans, snaked towards the south, its unhurried construction rate suggesting an offensive that could not possibly begin before mid-November, a full month after Montgomery actually intended to attack. Dummy artillery positions, fake radio traffic mimicking the electronic signature of a buildup, and even a fake railhead added texture to the deception. The scale of production was considerable. Alongside the sunshields, several hundred dummy tanks, several hundred dummy guns, and dozens of dummy vehicles of other types were built in a matter of weeks, much of it improvised from scrap timber, Hessian sacking, and whatever canvas could be scavenged from tents and lorry covers. Precise production figures remain difficult to pin down with certainty, since wartime camouflage units kept records that were themselves sometimes deliberately vague. But post-war accounts broadly agree on the order of magnitude involved, an effort measured in the thousands of individual deceptive items across the whole Alamein deception scheme. The logistics behind this illusion were, in their own way, as demanding as the illusion itself. Every sunshield had to be fitted, tested, and adjusted under desert conditions that punished canvas and warped timber within days, meaning workshops in Cairo were kept running continuously to supply replacements. Soldiers assigned to the camouflage units, many of them ordinary infantrymen and engineers with no artistic background whatsoever, had to be taught to think like set designers, positioning dummy vehicles not in neat rows that would look artificial from above, but in the scattered, slightly untidy arrangement that a genuine Army Leaguer would display. Shadows mattered enormously. A convincing dummy tank photographed at the wrong time of day, with its shadow falling in an unnatural direction or its silhouette too crisp against the sand, could unravel weeks of careful work in a single reconnaissance pass. Barkas insisted his team's study captured German aerial photographs of British positions to understand exactly what an enemy interpreter would be looking for, then built the deception specifically to satisfy that trained eye. Sound, too, played its part, with dummy wireless traffic generated to mimic the pattern of a headquarters preparing for a much later assault, thickening the deception across more than one German intelligence discipline at once. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The deception was tested in the days immediately before the battle, and as far as the historical record allows us to judge, it worked. German aerial photographs taken in the days before October 23rd show exactly the picture Barkas and Ayrton intended. Armor apparently concentrated and static in the north, disguised among transport, and a slow, methodical, clearly unfinished buildup in the south. When the Second Battle of El Alamein opened at 9:40 p.m. on October 23, 1942, with a barrage from more than 800 guns, the attack fell in the north, precisely where the sun-shielded tanks had been waiting, and precisely where Axis intelligence had rated the threat as comparatively low relative to their expectation of a longer preparation period. Rommel himself was still in Germany recovering from illness when the battle began, and the confusion in the German command in those opening days, partly a product of misjudged timing, owed something to the deception scheme that had persuaded Axis planners the offensive was not imminent. Prisoner interrogations conducted after the battle, along with captured German intelligence assessments, indicated that Axis commanders had indeed misjudged both the timing and the location of the main effort, though historians are careful to note that Bertram was one contributing factor among several, including genuine intelligence failures and the physical difficulty of penetrating minefields under any circumstances. What can be said with confidence is that the sun-shielded armor reached its start line without being identified as a concentrated armored threat, and that this achievement, however difficult to isolate in its precise battlefield effect, gave Montgomery's opening assault a measure of tactical surprise that a fully alerted defense would have denied him. The German equivalents to this kind of operational deception were, by comparison, limited in the North African theater specifically, though Germany had pioneered elements of camouflage and decoy technique on the Eastern Front and in defense of the Atlantic Wall, including dummy airfields and fake gun emplacements designed to draw Allied bombing away from genuine targets. What Rommel's forces generally lacked was the resourcing and specialist personnel to run a deception scheme of comparable scale and integration, combining physical decoys, radio deception, and controlled leakage of false information into a single coherent picture. The Americans, for their part, had not yet developed the sophisticated deception apparatus that would later produce the famous Ghost Army in the European theater from 1944 onwards, complete with inflatable tanks and sonic trucks broadcasting the recorded sound of armored columns. That unit, in fact, drew directly on lessons that British camouflage officers, including veterans of the North African deception schemes, helped pass across the Atlantic. In this sense, Operation Bertram sits as something of an ancestor to later, more famous Allied deception efforts, proof of concept for an idea that Britain would refine considerably by the time of Operation Fortitude ahead of the Normandy landings in 1944, when entire phantom armies of inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft helped convince German planners that the invasion would fall at Calais rather than Normandy. The essential British innovation at Alamein, using theatrical and artistic skill to solve a military problem, using illusion not merely to hide but to actively construct a false but convincing alternative reality, would become a hallmark of British deception planning for the remainder of the war. The men who carried out the deception rarely spoke of it afterwards with any great fanfare, and this reticence has shaped how the operation is remembered. Unlike the tank crews and infantrymen who fought their way through the Devil's Gardens, the camouflage officers left behind no medals for valor, only technical reports and a handful of photographs showing painted canvas standing in for steel. Geoffrey Barkas himself wrote a memoir after the war, The Camouflage Story, in which he described the peculiar psychological strain of the work, the constant awareness that a single careless mistake, A shadow in the wrong place or a dummy positioned with too much precision could betray the entire scheme to an observant enemy pilot. That strain was compounded by the knowledge that lives, potentially thousands of them, rested on illusions built from materials no sturdier than a garden shed. It is worth pausing on this point because it captures something important about the nature of deception as a weapon. Unlike a tank or a rifle, a decoy only works if it is never tested directly. Its success is measured by the absence of enemy action, by a battle that unfolds according to plan rather than one interrupted by a counterthrust that should never have been possible. That absence makes deception one of the hardest achievements in military history to prove conclusively, and one of the easiest for later skeptics to dismiss as coincidence. Assessing the precise impact of Operation Bertram remains, honestly, a matter of informed estimation rather than certainty.